Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
This is the way your impression will look when it comes back from the lab from silver plating. And you can see that it was blocked out in the areas where we didn't want the silver to plate, and the leads here from the wire were left on. So at this point we're going to carefully remove the leads from this impression, and the way you have to do this, you can, if you are not careful, dislodge the plating from the impression. So if you come back and you have the leads on, you're going to want to hold that down. It's hard to show with, there we go, you can see that. I'm holding that down in place, and I'm just going to tease the silver up, and it will break off at a point of high stress, which is right close to your margin. And you can see here that we have a little excess where it broke off and we did not dislodge the plate. Be sure that you hold it down before you attempt this. And you can see I'm holding it down with my thumb again, and we'll take this off. Now if these leads are very, very large, then you may want to cut that lead with a separating disc. If your leads look more like it does on this impression, for example, we would not try to break those loose, but would rather come in with a separating disc and cut those so that we did not dislodge that silver plate from the impression. Once the leads have been removed, we take out our excess little pieces of silver here. We are ready to actually start making this working model. Now we are going to make a working model with removable dies, and in order to facilitate formation of adequate bases, we are going to use a matrix material as a former for the die base. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure that I have a rib of wax coming up so that it just goes over the crest of the silver. I think you can see as we hold this here, we're going to place a rib of wax, and it just comes up on the crest of the silver. It does not get inside the silver plate. If you do not have this silver plate backed up with acrylic, it will fracture. It is quite weak. So here you can see we're just building up a rib of wax, and this is just utility wax along the crest of that silver. And at this point in time, the only thing that we're worried about keeping neat is not letting any wax inside the silver plate. Now we've completed placing ribs of wax along the crest of the silver of those dies. We're going to use matrix material, and this is simply the 7/16 matrix material which you have in your kit. And we will estimate the length that we need by holding it up to our impression, holding it out and estimate the length. Cut that amount of length off, and then turn it and cut that in half. 7/16 is just too much height for a die base. We don't need that much. So we cut that in half, and if we have to straighten the matrix a little bit, we can just pull it through the pliers. And now we'll hold it up here and get a trial fit. And what we want to do is just cut this so that it approximately fits inside of the rubber base. Once we have that where we want it, we can just simply place it right inside the wax and fit our next one. Now this next one is going to have to be a little bit shorter So we'll get an estimation here. Cut it off. And you can see here that it does go from directly across the rubber base, goes from side to side. We'll press this in and get it set right in that wax. Now as we look across this way, we would like these two pieces to be as parallel as possible. And if they're not parallel, as you can see here, we want to do a little bit of fitting, so we'll just cut the edge off this one. And now we have those parallel. And as you look down, you can see that the matrix metal is converging towards the cervical, because as we turn this over, this will give us taper to allow us to move the die out of the model. So we want these undercut this way, and we'll just seal in the matrix metal. And this is very quickly and easily done. This is not something that requires a lot of time. And just seal that in with wax. Now we're going to want to be able to be sure that we draw past this contact, and we don't want to destroy our ridge. That's why we've placed our matrix metal right up over the crest of that plated die, because we don't need the base any wider than our die is mesially distally. And in fact, on the bicuspid, we can't be any wider to the mesial, or it will hook underneath the proximal surface of the adjacent tooth, and we won't be able to remove the die. And we don't want to place a lot of excess taper on the strips, because we want to have a smooth, flat die base, so that we'll have a stable die that won't rock or rotate. We're just going to seal this second strip in, and then we'll be ready to place the acrylic in the die bases. Now in your kit, you should have 2 extra empty squeeze bottles like this. And what we're going to use those for is, you can put Durley liquid in one and Durley powder in the other. And these will be useful in making these dies. What you're going to do is drop a few drops of liquid into your dies, both the molar and the bicuspid. Take your second squeeze bottle with a powder in it and simply place your Durley powder in. Now we don't want to do this too fast. Durley does shrink as we build it up, but we can just progress along here. As the liquid gets to the point where it can't absorb any more powder, simply place some more liquid on top. And you can see here where we don't quite get the wax to seal as tight as we'd like it to, we start to lose a little bit of liquid out the side. So now I'm going to start speeding the process up a little bit. And we'll just continue this until we have these filled. And what we want to do, we want to fill these up just brim full. And the reason we want to do that is, if we do not fill them brim full, surface tension will tend to cause the die base to be curved, and we want it flat. So I'm just going to try to hold this impression in such a way that I can fill this molar base up totally, and the bicuspid also. Now what we want to do is watch and allow this acrylic to set up until it just starts losing gloss. And then it'll be stiff enough to place our die pins. And the die pins we're going to use are the Ney medium die pin. They have a flat side on one side. You can see it here. And that will help in anti-rotation. And it's always good to get into a habit of placing die pins with one convention. The one I like to use is by placing the flat always to the lingual. That way if I have a whole mess of dies lined up on a big case, I always know what way they go into the model. Now that the Duralay has lost its gloss, we're ready to place our die pins, and we can simply place them into the middle of our base. Just the knurled portion goes in. And we place each of these, and we want these to draw together, and we want them to draw so the bicuspid will come out past the contact. So the bicuspid will determine our line of draw, and we'll just adjust the molar so that it draws with it. The advantage of having your dies draw together is that if we want, for instance, to remove this in one piece, we could, but also when you're waxing, you are going to have a pontic in here that's going to be luted to the ridge. So you must be able to draw your molar past that pontic. So if we make it so that the bicuspid can draw past the contact, parallel the molar to that, we're not going to have any problems. And we'll simply let that set up. Now the acrylic is set, we're ready to seal the pins in. Easiest way to do that is take a little liquid on the brush, touch the base of the pin, and then we'll take a little bit of powder, pick it up on the brush, and seal that pin in. Now at this time you should be sure that the total perimeter around the base of that pin is sealed. Don't leave a little gap where stone can get in between the base and the pin. If you can see right here on the distal, there's this little void here where stone would get up in there and get over top of the flat of that pin. And we want to seal that area in to be sure that this die will be easily removed from the model base. So here we're just going to get that in there. And we just progress all the way around the die, making sure that we have it well sealed. Now we'll do the bicuspid. The anti-rotation feature of the pin is the flat side, and we can increase that with the Duralay if we paint up a positive key with Duralay and just enhance that anti-rotation by putting a little lug there. This will work better than a notch cut in the base of the acrylic with a burr, because the notches tend to be quite small, and the stone that adapts into them either has an air bubble in it, so that we have a problem with adaptation of the stone into the anti-rotation device, or there's a slight roughness and the stone is broken as the die is removed. So if we just paint up these little ribs, make sure they're smooth as they set, then we have good anti-rotation right in the die base. Now just before we pour this, we obviously have a problem with all the excess wax in our edentulous ridge area and in the adjacent tooth. So if we take our wax spatula and warm it up, lay it right on the matrix strip and make this one continuous surface as we go down, to the rubber base, and then we will just peel out what we don't want. And now when we pour this up, we will have a nice flat surface here, and we will have our complete representation of the edentulous ridge. The same thing is done on the bicuspid. It's always good to hold the die pins down as you do this so you don't dislodge the die from the impression. If that happens at this time, it can be a very difficult type of a problem to recover from, because it is very difficult to get that die in exactly the same position again and pour it up. And you can see that now that ridge area is clean and it is not encroached upon by the dies, and we're ready to pour that model and with that ridge area. Obviously we have to do the same thing with the adjacent tooth, so we'll get all the excess wax out of the adjacent tooth and make a nice smooth surface up to that cervical area so that we will have an accurate representation of what was in the mouth. Now we have removed all the excess wax. You can see that the adjacent tooth is free of any wax, the edentulous area is free of wax, and the area distal to the most distal abutment is free of wax. We are now ready to pour this impression. To ensure that the stone will not stick to the Duralay bases, we're going to use a little supersep and lubricate the acrylic. Do not use too much. The supersep is very thin, and if, however, left too thick or laking, it could destroy the adaptation of the stone to your die base. Now we're ready to pour, and I've pre-weighed some stone. If you can use a vacuum mix, you're better off. This is about 150 grams of stone, and we've pre-measured our water, and we'll mix this up and get it vibrated. I've vibrated this until all the bubbles have stopped coming out, and now we're ready to make our initial pour on the impression. We want to start in the side opposite the bridge. Just put a little bit of stone here, and this should be done slowly, and let that stone tease down each individual tooth. It'll come up over the crest of that cervical rubber and go right down into the next tooth. Now we're going to put some into the edentulous ridge area and over each die. Remember, we want a good representation of the die base in stone, so we want to do this on the vibrator. And hand vibrate in place. And what we want to do is come right around and build up around these pins so we have good adaptation of stone around the pin, and build up some stone height on the other side. Now, to make your second pour easier, it's a good idea to have the height of the stone on each side here during this initial pour the same height. And to make the second pour adhere well, we're going to put some retention mounds of stone on this first pour. Don't forget to put one in the ridge area and behind the most distal pin there. Now we can set this aside to get its initial set before the second pour. Okay. The first pour now has achieved its initial set, and we can expose the ends of these die pins, simply rubbing the stone off the very end of them. Remember, we don't want to expose them very far up because we want the stone around the die pin to help retain this removable die in place. So only about 1/8 of an inch of stone has been removed from the ends of those pins. And now we'll take some regular utility wax and make a small ball of wax to go around that pin, and this will help after the second pour in locating this pin, so that as we trim the base of the model, when we run into the utility wax, we know we're coming to the pin. So we can just take this ball of wax, place it over the pin like so, and we'll do the same for the second pin. So the first thing we'll do, make sure that this is moistened, so we'll dip it in some water, and this will help get good adhesion to the next mix of stone. And then we will make a second mix of stone. Again, we've pre-measured this, and we will mix this and vibrate it until all the bubbles are out of the stone. Now that we've vibrated the second mix of stone until there are no air bubbles in it, and we're just going to adapt this to our first pour, and this is done with a little hand vibration. You notice I'm teasing the stone down in between our stone retention lugs and around the ball of wax we've placed up there to locate the end of our pin. And we're just going to come all the way around this model and adapt this stone around our first pour very well. We don't want to allow the chance that we would have some air voids in there that would allow the first pour to break off from the second pour. With our remainder of stone, put it out on the slab. You can see the consistency of this stone. It's properly mixed. It's not running all over the place. We can work with it. And we'll just form a platform, and this will be the base of our model. And now it's going to pay off because we made all those little stone retention lugs the same height, because when we turn this over and set it down, it'll just stay there. And we can just pull up the stone around the back, make sure that we have good adhesion. You notice that we're very careful not to lock the stone around the tray in the tongue space. And we'll just do our final adaptation of the first pour this way, pulling the stone up all the way around the model. Now, as you know, wet stone is considerably weaker than dry stone, so we're going to set this aside to dry for a 24-hour period, and it should be in a fairly well-ventilated area. You can place it in your locker, but do not place it in a small drawer or in your articulator box. After the stone has set for 24 hours in open air, this stone will be very hard. The dry stone is much, much harder than the wet stone, so it is important that you allow this to set about 24 hours. Now you can see in our pour up that we have not locked the tray in with stone, and we will attempt to remove this without sectioning the tray. If you are very careful and get in here and just start to pry around the periphery and take this straight off, generally you can take a impression tray off without sectioning it and without destroying your model. Now, if the mouth you're working with is periodontally involved and has very, very long teeth, a lot of gingival tissue missing, then you may indeed have to section the tray. But usually, your impression will pop clean, your teeth will be complete, and we have a completed model. Now the model has been trimmed, and we have trimmed the bottom to expose the red utility wax that we placed on the tip of the die pin. And now, in order to remove these dies, what we have to do is remove our utility wax, and we would like to get this as clean as possible before pushing the die out of the model, because any utility wax that you leave here has the potential to be trapped inside the die pin hole, and once that happens, you will not be able to seat your die completely, and of course then the die is high in the model and you have problem getting the proper occlusion on your restoration. So we'll just dig these out as cleanly as we possibly can. Once all the wax has been removed from around the pins, it's a good idea to use a stream of air to make sure that there are no chips of stone left in these areas before you knock the die out. Once that is done, we can place the tip of our wax spatula on the end of the die pin, pushing it up, moves it out of the model. Now you can see that we have a model with an intact residual ridge. We have nice smooth stone down below the die base, and you can see the retentive areas in stone that match the retentive areas on the bottom of the die. When you get to this point, take your model, place it well away from your work area, and start cleaning up your dies. You can now just take the matrix metal off and the excess wax and get ready to start trimming these dies.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.